Good afternoon, everybody. Uh, my name is John Laffey. I'm the technical manager here at PJR. I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. We're going to be talking about risk assessment and risk treatment in terms of ISO 27001's requirements. Just a quick disclaimer. So we are using a new platform today for the first time to go ahead and broadcast this webinar. So hopefully all the bugs are ironed out, but please bear with me if there's any technical difficulties. Again, we feel really positive about this. We think it's a lot better interface. It's going to allow for a lot more interaction. You guys also get to look at my face now, so something new for me to adjust to, but we'll get through it. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Couple quick notes. All participants have been muted, but the new software here does have a Q&A section of the dashboard. I will try and keep an eye on it as questions are asked during the presentation. If it's something that I can answer at that time, I certainly will do so. If I miss it or it doesn't really lend itself to what we're looking at right now, certainly we'll follow up with any questions asked at the conclusion of the presentation. So please feel free, and I would encourage you to go ahead and use that, and hopefully we can all have some good interaction here today. Oh, okay. So I just got a notification from one of the attendees letting me know that they can see the PowerPoint presentation, but not the presenter. So there's our first hiccup. Let me see if there's anything I can do on that real quick. It doesn't look like something I'm going to be able to control, so I'm just going to go ahead and press on, but thanks for letting us know that. I'll certainly follow up with our IT staff after this is done. All right, here's a quick rundown of the topics we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the context, approach, and criteria for the risk management. We're going to take a look at risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. And then we're going to go ahead and get into selecting risk treatment, implementing risk treatment, and then evaluating and assessing the effectiveness of the treatment. And then again, at the conclusion, we'll go ahead and answer any questions that were asked. All right, so in terms of context, approach, and criteria, the internal and external context of your organization and scope of the IMS will be the key drivers in determining the criteria that will be needed for your risk evaluation, impact, and acceptance. For example, contractual or regulatory requirements applicable to your organization could certainly have a large influence on what your risk acceptance criteria will be. The risk assessment process should be reflective of the industry sector and risks related to the organization, as well as expectations of stakeholders and the current threat landscape. There are many different information security risk management strategies and approaches. ISO 27001 does not prescribe that a particular one be used. The standard does require, however, that assessments be performed at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed to occur. A little additional note, significant changes in terms of things that could affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your information assets. While the standard does not specify what the risk acceptance criteria should be, it does require that it be established and maintained. Additionally, the standard also requires that risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information be identified. Risk identification. So the standard requires, again, risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability within the scope of the IMS be identified, which can seem like an overwhelming task, especially if there's no formal approach that has been planned for guiding the process. Again, it does not require a specific approach be used, but for illustrative purposes, I'll outline a commonly used method that I've seen and read about, just to hopefully do a better job of explaining exactly what's involved with risk assessment. I just want to say this is in no way implying that this is the method that is most effective for your specific organization or should be the method used. All right, so the first step to identify is to identify the information assets within the scope of the ISMS, keeping in mind that assets are not just hardware and software, but anything of value to the organization. For this example, let's assume that there are primary assets, which would be things like business processes and information, and then there's supporting assets, which would be things like hardware, software, network, personnel, physical site, organizational structure. By identifying the primary assets, again, critical business processes and/or information in the scope of the ISMS, you can then identify the supporting assets, which could potentially affect the confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability of the primary assets. Identify an asset owner for all the identified assets. This should be someone most appropriate for being responsible and accountable for the asset. In many cases, the asset owner is the person best suited to determine the asset's value to the organization. Identify threats to that primary asset and its supporting assets identified in the previous step, keeping in mind that threats may be accidental or deliberate and of natural or human origin. To ensure a comprehensive list is created as well as limit the magnitude of this initial step, you consider using generic threat types such as unauthorized access, physical damage, or technical failure. And then where specific individual threats of a certain type warrant explicit identification, go ahead and make sure you enumerate those. Factors that would influence if a specific threat be identified should include the criticality of the asset they are associated with, as well as the level of damage they could cause if realized. When determining threats, please consider soliciting input from as many resources as you are able to, including asset owners, users, related staff members, legal departments, legal bodies, physical and informational security specialists, etc. The more threat listing that you can generate, the more informed and protected you can be. So the next step would be to identify any existing controls already in place or planned to be implemented. This step may simply be a review of existing documentation of implemented controls in place, or if this is the initial iteration of the assessment and treatment process, it may be a bit more involved. If no existing controls documentation exists, you will need to check with the individuals responsible for information security to get a comprehensive list of controls already in place. The primary objective of this step is to avoid wasting time and money by duplicating controls. After completing this, you should have a list of all existing or planned controls as well as their implementation and usage status. Then you want to go ahead and identify vulnerabilities related to those identified assets in the previous step. Vulnerabilities would be weaknesses associated with assets or controls that could be exploited by one or more threats. There's a bunch of resources that can be used to assist with vulnerability identification, including lists of common threats and associated vulnerabilities, automated vulnerability scanners, penetration testing, code review, etc. After performing this step, you should have a list of vulnerabilities in relation to your assets, threats, and existing controls. Additionally, ISO 27001 also requires that a risk owner is identified for all risks, and these owners need to have the accountability and authority to manage their identified risks. So that's a key step, making sure all those identified risks also get assigned a risk owner. To summarize, the goal of the identification process is to have a complete list of information assets with their associated threats, vulnerabilities, and a listing of existing and planned controls, as well as their implementation status. After you have this information put together, you'll be prepared to go ahead and perform the analysis. Again, there are many methods of risk analysis that can be used. And again, ISO 27001 does not require specific methodology to be employed. Continuing with our example method, the next step would be to identify consequences that the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability may have on the identified assets. A consequence could be loss of effectiveness, adverse operating conditions, loss of business, reputation damage, financial damages, etc. By taking the list of assets and associated threats and vulnerabilities, scenarios can be drawn up by describing a threat exploiting a vulnerability. The scenario should include operational consequences in terms of investigation and repair time, downtime, opportunity lost, health and safety, financial cost, image, reputation, and goodwill. These are all things that should be considered at this point. Depending on the approach adopted by your organization, a qualitative or quantitative risk analysis methodology may be in place. In short, a qualitative analysis approach will employ a more subjective rating system for potential consequences and likelihoods, such as low, medium, and high, while a quantitative approach will use numerical values for consequences and likelihood. Each approach has its merits and can be effective methods of risk analysis. Yeah. To determine the level of risk, typically the consequence and likelihood values are combined to generate a raw risk value. So now, at this point, you have risks and levels of risk identified. You can go ahead and evaluate and prioritize them in terms of requiring treatment. ISO 27001 requires that organizations evaluate the risk by comparing the risk analysis results against the criteria for performing information security risk assessments, as well as the risk acceptance criteria that they have determined appropriate for their ISMS. The last step in the assessment process is to use the information gathered during the previous steps to make informed decisions and take action. The standard requires that untreated risks that are beyond the established acceptable level of risk must be treated. Additionally, the risks must be prioritized for risk treatment. Additional considerations besides the established acceptable level of risk that may be used include the importance or criticality of the asset the risk is associated with, and the degree of confidence in the risk assessment process, as well as any applicable contractual, legal, and regulatory requirements. And in terms of establishing your acceptable level of risk, because some people might be inclined to adopt an inordinately high acceptable level of risk, you're going to want to keep in mind what your objectives are for your information security management system. Typically, they're going to be something along the lines of protecting the information, yours or your clients, effectively. So if that is the objective of your ISMS overall, you're going to want to make sure that your risk acceptance level falls in line with that. All right, risk treatment. So selecting risk treatment options. Broadly speaking, there are 4 options typically available for treating a risk. First would be avoidance. So you just choose not to take on the risk by avoiding the actions that could cause it. Or mitigation. Take actions that reduce the risk by reducing the likelihood, consequences, or both. Transfer, which is to transfer or share some or all of the risk to a party. And last would be acceptance. Choose to take on the risk as it currently stands. And this is common if the evaluated level of risk meets or falls under the acceptable level defined without treatment. These 4 options are not mutually exclusive. It's very common to see a risk be reduced to an acceptable level, at which point it is accepted by the organization. In terms of information security related risks and the requirements of ISO 27001, the primary method of treatment will be the implementation or modification of controls. The standard requires that you reference the controls in Annex A to ensure that none have been omitted that may be applicable to your ISMS. But please remember that you are free to implement controls now already present in Annex A as needed. So you're not limited to only using the controls in Annex A. The selection of controls needed should take into account the risk acceptance criteria established during the assessment phase, as well as, again, legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements. While the risk of not complying with legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements will typically never be acceptable, for other identified risks, it is expected that the cost of implementing and ongoing maintenance of selected controls will be evaluated against the value of the assets they will protect and overall return on investment. In addition to any financial constraints, the following factors should also be taken into consideration when selecting your controls. Time constraints. So the proposed control would take an unacceptable amount of time to be implemented. Technical constraints. The proposed control would impact the performance of key systems, making them ineffective for business purposes. Operational constraints. A proposed control would require additional oversight and management that cannot be supported. Environmental constraints. A proposed control would require a new facility to accommodate the space requirements. Or legal constraints. An existing regulation requires data of a certain type to be encrypted in a particular manner. By considering all these factors when selecting controls, you will be in a good position to have an attainable risk treatment plan put together. After defining, did I skip a slide? No. After defining your risk treatment plan, you will need to determine any residual risks. This is done through another iteration of the assessment on the identified risk, taking into account the expected effects of any proposed treatments. The level of risk expected to still remain after the treatment has been implemented is referred to as the residual risk. If residual risks exist that do not meet the established acceptance criteria, another iteration of risk treatment selection may be necessary. The treatment plan should also include the person or persons responsible for implementation, expected date of completion of the implementation, the current status of the implementation, and must be approved by all identified risk owners, indicating their approval of the plan and acceptance of all expected residual risk. Assessing treatment effectiveness. So the method of assessing the effectiveness of your treatment plan is going to depend on the nature of the risk being treated. For example, if an identified risk was an unsecured door to an area with sensitive information and was treated by the installation of a lock or card access system, it would be reasonable to see something along the lines of it being tested and verified to be working as intended. If the risk involved unpatched systems being vulnerable to attacks, the treatment evaluation may be a weekly report showing numbers of unpatched systems still in use, and would require ongoing monitoring to determine if the actions being taken are reducing the risk to the required level. Other methods of evaluating treatment effectiveness may include internal or third-party audits, vulnerability scans, penetration testing, a review of the number of security incidents that have taken place, etc. Regardless of the nature of evaluation, the critical part is that it is being done and that actions are being taken in the event a treatment option is found to be ineffective. Additionally, the status of the risk treatment plan is required to be discussed during the management review as outlined in ISO 27001. So you want to make sure that it doesn't just exist as something at a single point in time. The risk treatment plan and the status of controls in place should be continually monitored and reviewed to ensure their ongoing effectiveness. All right, and that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation today on risk assessment and risk treatment. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to the question and answers tab here and see that we have no questions yet. But go ahead and please feel free at this time. I'd love to get a feel for how the new platform here handles question and answers. So if anybody has any questions about this or anything related to ISO 27001, please feel free to go ahead and ask away. All right, nothing yet. So I also like to thank again everybody for joining us today. Apologize for the video not working for everybody. We'll get that ironed out for sure after this. Oh, Charles, just use the question and answers tab, so that's good. I know it works. Just letting us know he enjoyed it and he'll try some more. So Charles, thank you very much. Glad to have you and appreciate you attending, and hope you get some value out of it. All right, well, I'm going to leave this open for a few more minutes. So if anybody does have any questions, again, feel free to ask. Also, please feel free, if you'd like, you can reach out to us here at Perry Johnson Registrars. You can give us a call at 800-7910. Or you can contact me directly. My email address is jlaffey@pjr.com. All right, well, thanks everybody. I'm going to go ahead and shut it down, but I will be back in a few weeks with another webinar, so we'll hope to see you then. Thanks again.